Hello, it's Alex and welcome to Hey Little Thrifter. Today I'm going to be talking about all of the books I read in September. I had a pretty good reading month. I ended up reading 9 books and mostly horror, and I ended up having ratings all the way from a really great 4.5 star, almost a 5 star, and all the way down to a 2.5. So yeah, but thankfully most of them I did really enjoy. And first up, I read Journey by Joyce Carol Thomas. This originally came out in 1988 and it is a young adult teen focused story about a teenage girl called Maggie, and some of her friends and other local teenagers are disappearing and no one knows what's happening to them or why, or if they're related, and she takes it upon herself to look into what's going on. But during her investigations it turns out that she might be the next target for whatever is happening to these teenagers. This is written by a black author and features a black protagonist as well as some other black characters, and it does touch on race and racism and the black experience, and it also includes themes like friendship and family. And yeah, it's really well written. I really enjoyed her writing style. It was very evocative and had some really beautiful moments, and it also includes a kind of fantasy or magical realism element involving spiders, hence the cover, which I thought was really unique and interesting, and yeah, just made for a really unique story. I won't go into detail and spoil what's going on behind the disappearances, but again, I thought it was quite unique and was not what I was expecting from the beginning. There are some characters introduced throughout the story, and yeah, obviously as things progress we learn exactly what's going on. So yeah, I thought that was pretty well done, and it was just an enjoyable, well-written read. I'm really glad I read this one, and I rated it 4 stars. Next up is an anthology. It is Weird Women, classic supernatural fiction from groundbreaking female writers, 1852 to 1923. Longest title ever. And this is a really excellent collection of short stories by an array of female authors throughout this period, and I thought it was a really great mix of some authors I had heard of but not necessarily read anything by, and a bunch of authors I had never heard of before. So a really great mixture of stuff in here, and all well worth a read. I did rate each story individually and everything was 3 stars or higher, so it was all good, if not better, and I ended up rating the collection overall 4 stars. And I do have a separate review video for this if you want to hear more of my thoughts, so I will leave a link to that if you want to check it out. Okay, next up is The Good House by Tananarive Due, and this was my favourite book of the whole month. This was such a great read. I buddy read this with my friend Emily and we both thoroughly enjoyed it. And this is about a character called Angela, and the titular good house is a house in a town in the Pacific Northwest that used to belong to Angela's grandmother and now belongs to Angela. And there's something that happens near the beginning of the book. There's a family tragedy that occurs, and Angela then leaves the good house and is dealing with what happened and trying to get her life back together. And the story picks up a couple of years later and she travels back to the good house in order to decide whether she wants to keep it or if she's going to sell it. And that is kind of where the main story picks up, but it is told over different time periods and we do hear from multiple perspectives, and I thought that was really well done. I didn't find that confusing at all. It was really well put together in that respect. So as the story goes on, we learn a bit more about Angela's grandmother, Marie Toussaint, and she was known in the area as someone who was into maybe voodoo or witchcraft or something dark and potentially dangerous like that, and we learn how that may have played a part in the family tragedy and how that affects Angela herself and moving forward and everything. This was such a wonderful read. It really is one that I would highly recommend checking out if you haven't already. If I could only choose one word to describe it, it would be rich. It is so layered and detailed that, yeah, it was just a really rich reading experience, I thought. I thought all of the characters were super well fleshed out and detailed, and you know, we do kind of get to hear from a lot of different perspectives, which really helped get to know them. And the story itself is, like I say, really layered. There are a lot of elements going on and different time periods, but it just came together to make a really compelling story. This is a pretty long book. I think it's almost 500 pages long, and there's a lot of text on each page here, so it is a pretty long read, but it didn't feel that way, at least not in a bad way. It was a really great reading experience that I was, yeah, thoroughly consumed by while I was reading it. I just kept wanting to read one more chapter, and yeah, me and Emily got through it pretty quickly. We did, when we were chatting about the book as we were reading it, did notice some kind of shades of Stephen King in here. I think the few that we brought up were The Shining, Pet Sematary and It. And yeah, there are definitely some elements there that, you know, can be seen here, but this is definitely Due's own story. It was really unique and really well crafted. And she does actually mention Stephen King at one point, so I assume that was just a little nod to, you know, maybe some inspiration. So we have this voodoo and kind of supernatural and magic element to the story, which was really interesting and really well done. There's also a lot of family drama, for want of a better term, and the relationships between all of these different characters. And there's also some sex and violence thrown in for good measure, which I thought again was all really well written and really worked as part of the story as a whole. And there were some creepy moments throughout the story as well. So yeah, this was just such an excellent read. I can't say enough good things about it, quite honestly, and it's definitely one that I would recommend. And I did only have a little bit of an issue with a couple of things, which is why it didn't quite hit a 5-star rating for me, but it did end up getting 4.5 stars, which is really close. And I'm not going to go into detail on why those were because they are quite spoilery, but while it didn't quite hit the 5-star rating for me, it was still such an excellent read, and it didn't necessarily spoil my having enjoyed the rest of the book, even though there were a couple of things that didn't quite work for me. So, highly recommend. Next up I read Slimer by Harry Adam Knight, and this was another buddy read. I read this with the lovely Jordaline over at Jordaline Reads. I will leave her channel linked in case you aren't already following her. This was a really fun read. It is about a group of 6 20-somethings who are stranded at sea in a boat, and as they're trying to, you know, find rescue, they end up coming across an oil rig. So they're like, great, we're saved, and they get into the oil rig itself and find out that it seems to be completely abandoned. So that's a bit odd. So they start searching the whole place and looking for someone that might be there or some way of communicating and getting rescue. So as they explore, they find out that this doesn't seem to be like a regular oil rig. There seems to be all of this like laboratory setup, and they just don't really know what could be going on. And on top of this, they experience some strange encounters with some black goo. And it turns out that there's a shape-shifting monster on the oil rig, and of course it wants to kill them all. So yeah, this was just a really fun read, and it's a pretty quick read as well. It's not very long, and we flew through it in I think just a couple of days. And while I did enjoy this one, I did think it took a bit too long to kind of really get going for me. There's quite a lot of setup, and they do seem to spend quite a bit of time exploring the oil rig and such like before things really kick into a higher gear. From that point though, it got really good, very entertaining and action-packed, and the monster itself I thought was awesome. The different ways it was described were really excellent and really effective. There were actually a couple of pretty creepy moments involving it and the things that it does. I'm not going to go into detail, but I thought the story behind it was interesting and well put together. So it was kind of an odd mix of having this like pretty, you know, intelligent and well put together backstory and detail, but really it's just like a really schlocky, fun romp. So yeah, it was kind of an odd mix. It worked, it was very entertaining. The 6 main characters are kind of a mixed bag. A couple of them aren't particularly likeable, and then the others are kind of, they're okay, they're a little bit flat, but they were, you know, they were fine. And right at the beginning, as we're introduced to them, there was one called Alex, so I was like, oh, that's fun, but turns out he's like the worst one of the bunch. He's like a complete douchebag, and I was like, oh, great. So that was amusing, and yeah, he's really something else. He is a complete sexist pig. He's very misogynistic. He's basically trying to rape all of the women that are there, and yeah, that's just him on a normal day. So pretty gross. So yeah, there is some sexual content here, some of it of a non-consensual variety. So just to make that clear for anyone who needs that information. But yeah, otherwise this was a fun and quick romp, and yeah, some of it was very kind of over the top and silly, but very entertaining. And I think I rated this 3 stars when I finished it, but looking back I think it's maybe more of a 3.5. Next up, I read The Catacombs. This is book 6 in the Power series by Jessie Harris, following teenage psychic Mackenzie Gold. In this one, Mackenzie and her friends are spending some time at the local amusement park, and there's a new ride that's opened called The Catacombs. Anyway, while they're there and having a good time, Mackenzie starts to have a really bad feeling, and not long after, there is a teenage girl who is pulled out of one of these rides, and obviously there's something shady going on. So she is now looking into what exactly is going on in this place, and there is a group of people who are part of the amusement park's freak show, and while all of the characters were your kind of cliched freaks, for want of a better term, you know, we've got a little guy, we've got a tall guy, we've got a fat lady, etc. But I thought they were depicted well, you know, considering this was just a slim read aimed at teenagers from the 90s, you know, it could have been a lot worse. And there is a section where Mackenzie and her boyfriend are going through the freak show, and they're just like, this is really uncomfortable, like, why should we be looking at these people as freaks and as a spectacle, you know, that's just a really outdated and quite horrible thing. And yeah, so it does touch on that, and I thought it was handled quite well. There is one member of this group of people who is like the villain, and I thought she was a really great villain. I thought she was really well detailed, and her kind of backstory and her motivations were interesting. And I think the only thing that I didn't like as much in this one is there was more of a supernatural element here, which I don't think the other books in the series had, even though they are, you know, paranormal and are involving like psychic abilities and stuff. So there's definitely a level of, you know, suspension of disbelief going on here anyway, but I think the other stories are still kind of grounded really well in reality, and so they felt really believable, whereas this one with the supernatural element, I don't know, it just didn't work as well, I don't think. So I rated this one 3.5 stars. It wasn't my favourite of the series, but it was still good and enjoyable. And yeah, I've only got 2 more books to read in the series, books 7 and 8. So I'm hoping to read them by the end of the year, and then I'll do a video about the whole series. Next, I read The Invention of Sound by Chuck Palahniuk. This was a new release, it just came out very recently, and I used to be a really huge Chuck Palahniuk fan. I think I started reading his stuff probably like mid-2000s, I want to say, and yeah, he was definitely one of my favourite authors for quite a long time, and I would still class some of his books as my favourites. And there was a point though, after being a fan of his for some years, that, I don't know, I guess I just, not like lost interest, but I just moved on to other things, I guess. And so I haven't actually read any of his stuff for several years, but when I heard about this one, I was like, oh man, this is the book for me. I need to get this one. So yeah, picked it up, was a little trepidatious because yeah, I wasn't sure how I would feel about his writing after so long, but this was awesome. I thoroughly enjoyed it. This was like a really solid 4-star read. So what is it actually about? We are following 2 main characters here. One of them, Gates, is a middle-aged man, and 17 years ago his young daughter went missing, and he is still on the hunt to try and find her. And the other main character is Mitzi, who is a 20-something living in Los Angeles, and she works as a Foley artist, so she records sound for movies. And of course, as the story goes on, the 2 characters' stories come together, and I'm not going to go into detail on how that is, but it was really great. And yeah, his writing here I thoroughly enjoyed. It felt like classic Chuck, you know, and if you've ever read any of his stuff, you'll know what I mean, but this one was really well written. I think he definitely has his own unique style, and he has this way of including so many like kind of snippets and tidbits, like each of which could be, you know, expanded into its own novel probably, but he includes them all in one, yet they all work for the overall story and make for a really interesting and compelling story. And yeah, I don't want to say too much more about this one because I think it would give things away, and I went into this just knowing, you know, that kind of brief synopsis that I mentioned, so I think that's how other readers should go into it. But yeah, this one had some really dark moments. It does include some dark subject matter, and there were a couple of kind of horror-ish moments, like a couple of things that made me wince a little bit as I was reading, that were quite gross and really well done. And there were some times, yeah, that it made me chuckle to myself, and other times that it actually brought tears to my eyes. So yeah, quite an emotional read in many ways. But yeah, needless to say, I definitely recommend this one. I rated it 4 stars. Okay, next up I read the new Grady Hendrix novel, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, and I listened to the audio version of this, which was narrated by Barney Turpin, and unfortunately this was my least favourite book of this month. I rated it 2.5 stars, and I kind of wonder if that was being a bit generous. It might be more of a 2, and I just didn't enjoy this one. I know I've seen like pretty much nothing but 5-star reviews flying around about this one, and that's great. If you enjoyed it, I'm glad you did, but unfortunately I didn't have the same experience. So in case you haven't heard about this one, the premise is quite similar to the film Fright Night, where the main character suspects a neighbour of being a vampire, but instead of the protagonist being a teenage boy, this one, it is a middle-aged woman who is a housewife. And yeah, on paper that premise sounds like a lot of fun, and I was looking forward to reading this one. And I don't think it was because of other people hyping it up so much. You know, the fact is I've read 3 of his other novels already: Horrorshow, My Best Friend's Exorcism, and We Sold Our Souls, and I thought they were all excellent. They were all solid 4-star reads for me, and so naturally I was assuming I would also enjoy his next one. But this one just fell really flat for me. I found the story actually quite boring. It was very slow and I found it quite repetitive, and the characters themselves just felt, again, really flat and kind of uninteresting. The main character, Patricia, yeah, she was just like a non-character, like there was just nothing to her. And then the neighbour character, who is the vampire, was also just really flat and came across as really awkward when I assume he was meant to be, you know, very charming and charismatic, but I don't know, it just didn't work for me. And I considered DNFing this a couple of times because I was just not into it, but I stuck with it because I really wanted to like it, you know. I thought it's bound to pick up at any moment. And I will say it did pick up towards the end, but it wasn't until like the last quarter or so that I actually got to the point where I cared a little bit about where the story was going to go, which, you know, is way too late to, you know, have that kind of level of investment. And even then it was more of a mild curiosity at that point than really caring too much. And I don't know, it's hard to put my finger on exactly what didn't work for me here, but comparing it to the other books of his that I've read and enjoyed, they all had really interesting and compelling stories, which I don't feel this one did. And the characters in the other ones I felt, you know, some kind of connection with. I could relate to them and I was invested in their stories in one way or another, and I didn't have that in this one either. So I don't know, unfortunately this was just a flop for me and it just didn't do anything for me, I think, is the bottom line. So yeah, it's a 2-star, 2.5 if I'm being generous, I guess. Yeah, let me know if you read this one. I would love to hear your thoughts. Okay, 2 more books to talk about. Next up is Invention of the Body Snatchers by Jack Finney. This is a classic science fiction novel which was originally published in 1955, and it's set in a small town in California, and our main character here is a doctor, and he starts to have quite a number of patients coming to see him, and their problem is very similar in that they each believe that their husband or their father or, you know, someone they know very well seems different and doesn't seem to actually be that person, like something's wrong. And yeah, it turns out, as I don't think this is a spoiler because this book is such a classic, it's kind of just ingrained in popular culture, I think. But yeah, basically there is this alien life form that is taking over people in this town and kind of producing copies of them to take over the people. And they have been slowly infiltrating the people of this small town, and soon it is only the doctor and a few other characters who are left and are trying to survive and not be taken over by the aliens. And before reading this, I have already seen 2 film adaptations over the years. I've seen the 1956 version and the 78 version, and both are excellent. So going into this book, I already knew the storyline, but this was really great. I'm so glad I read it, because it was still, even though I knew what was going to happen, it still had its own surprises, and just the differences in, you know, this particular story were really interesting to see. I thought it was, yeah, interesting to see those similarities and differences between the films and the book. And without going into detail on what those differences might be, I did think for each particular book or film, what happened there was perfect for each one, if that makes sense. So yeah, this was great, and I think still really holds up as a unique and groundbreaking story. And yeah, the things that happen here really are quite unsettling, and there were definitely some chilling moments in here that, yeah, still really resonate today as quite a big fear that we probably would all have on not being ourselves anymore and being taken over by something else. And I really enjoyed his writing style. It comes across as very personable, and yeah, this main character is quite chummy in the way that he kind of talks to the reader. And yeah, there are definitely some, you know, gender stereotypes of that time period that are a little awkward to read now, but it was funny because they actually came across as a more charming in a way than it did, you know, completely anger inducing. So that was nice. And there is a love interest, like a kind of main female character alongside this doctor, and I thought she was really well written as well, and is a bit of a badass also, so that was really cool. So I'm really glad I finally picked this one up. It's one I've been meaning to read for ages, and it was excellent. I rated it 4 stars. Okay, and last but not least is Horrorshow by David Darke. This is a pen name for Ron D, and this is a Zebra title from 1994. And yeah, this was another fun romp in, you know, a similar vein to Slimer. You know, you kind of know from the title and the cover what you're getting. This one starts off 25 years ago, and we learn about this guy who runs a horror show on like the local TV station. His stage name is Giuseppe, and yeah, he's a pretty interesting character, and he is putting on a special show for Halloween night. And on the same night there is a local family who are brutally murdered in their home, and then while Giuseppe is live on air doing his Halloween show, he is killed. And yeah, the details are a little hazy, but he basically goes down as a local legend, and there have always been rumours that he was responsible for the murders, but yeah, since he died, nothing really happens. So the town moves on, and the story then picks up 25 years later, and we're following a character called Jim, who is a 20-something, and he, some years previously, kind of broke out of the small town and went to Los Angeles with big dreams of making it big, but that didn't happen, and he ended up coming back to his hometown kind of with his tail between his legs, but making up enough stories about his time there that it was more like his decision to come back rather than that he was kind of forced to do so. So he's kind of the cool, interesting guy, and he's so cool that he likes 17-year-old girls, and he is currently dating a girl called Laurie and is constantly pressuring her to have sex. She is a virgin, and yeah, it's just all super gross. So yeah, Jim isn't a particularly likable character. His best friend Greg is kind of in his shadow, and you know, is kind of just his dog's body type friend who, you know, Jim always you know, kind of shits on, but Greg, you know, he's his only friend really. So anyway, we've established that Jim's kind of a douchebag. Anyway, we do learn about several other characters here, but he's kind of the main one that we're following. And Jim and his friend both now work at the local TV station where Giuseppe used to work, and they are going to be putting on a special Halloween night show on TV. And they hear about the legend of Giuseppe, and there's a rumour that there is a recording of that final show of his, but no one knows where it is. And anyway, they are determined to try and track it down and play it on air as part of their Halloween show. There's kind of a lot going on here, and that's kind of both for better and for worse, I think, because it has quite an interesting storyline here, and there's an element where all of the people in this town are like seeing things in the TV static when they're at home watching their own TVs and the station isn't tuned in. A lot of people choose to spend their time watching the static and they can see things in there, which I thought was a really interesting idea, and it's somewhat developed, but I don't know, not quite enough to be really satisfying. The other major element of this book is the sexual content. There is a lot of it, so yeah, if you do not like graphic sex scenes, then I would not pick up this book because it's chock full of that stuff. And there is some violence here as well. There is some right at the beginning of the story, and then it kind of fades away for quite a chunk and then comes back towards the end. And I thought, yeah, that was all really well done and kind of schlocky and fun, but it seemed to take a bit of a backseat to the sexual content, which, you know, it's fine, but I wish there'd been a bit more of a balance between the two, or even some of the other elements of the story, like the stuff to do with the TV static. Like, I wish that had been developed a bit more, because it just felt like that was a really interesting component that, yeah, was kind of put on the back burner in favour of more sex scenes. Yeah, quite honestly. So this was a fun read nonetheless, and I rated it 3.5 stars. And this is a Halloween related book, so if you're looking for a Halloween read, you may or may not want to add this one to your list. And I read this as a prompt for Richard at Are You Into Horrors readathon. I think it's like a Halloween 3-month readathon going through August, September and October, and I read this as the September prompt. I'll leave his channel linked as well, so definitely go check him out if you're not already following him. And that was it. Those were all of the books I read in September. Let me know if you've read any of these. I would love to hear your thoughts, or tell me about what you've been reading recently. I would love to hear any recommendations you might have. Thank you ever so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully I will see you again in my next video. Bye!